All right, welcome everybody. This is Mr. Huff. We're going to be talking about lesson 212 today, states' rights and the division of powers. And what we're going to be getting into in this unit is the idea of federalism. And federalism is something that we did talk about a few lessons ago. And just to kind of refresh your memory, federalism is the system that we have in the United States where there are actually two different levels of government. We have a central government based in Washington, D.C. We call that the federal government. But we also have individual state governments, right? There's a state government in South Carolina. There's a state government in Georgia and North Carolina. All the states have a state government. And so how is it that things are shared or powers are shared between the federal government based in Washington and then the state government based in Columbia? And that's what we're going to get into in this unit. All right. I want to point out these key words here, guys. These are super, super important terms that we are going to get into today. I strongly encourage you to, in your notes, go ahead and write down these terms: concurrent power, delegated powers, exclusive powers, expressed powers, implied powers, inherent powers, reserved powers. All right. And I know you're thinking, wow, those all sound kind of the same. That's going to get confusing. And yes, it is. But we're going to talk about each one of those things today. But it's really important that you put this into your notes so that you can have something to go back and study from. Okay. So that's my advice to you. Okay, so what is federalism? Well, federalism is a system the Founding Fathers chose to balance the power of the state governments and the national government. Each level of government has its own powers determined in the Constitution. Okay, so for example, national powers, making treaties with other nations. South Carolina can't go make a treaty with Canada. That's something that only the federal government can do. Produce currency. South Carolina doesn't make its own money. Declare war. South Carolina can't go declare war. Those are national powers only for the federal government. And then there are some state powers. Establishing public education. The education system is run at the state level. Driving laws. The driver's license rules are different in South Carolina than they are in North Carolina or Georgia or anywhere else. And that's because each state sets its own rules. There's no federal level driver's license or traffic laws, that sort of thing. And the states have the power to establish laws. Okay. And so those are things that are specific to the national government or the state government. But then there are some things that are shared, and we call those concurrent powers. And that's an important term. It's one of our terms, concurrent powers. And concurrent powers are powers that both the federal government and the state government have. So, for example, making and enforcing legislation. There are state laws and there are federal laws. And the federal government makes laws in Congress, and the state government makes laws in the General Assembly, but both have the power to do that. Creating and enforcing environmental and health regulations, regulating taxes. South Carolina collects taxes. The federal government collects taxes. All right, so those are concurrent powers that are shared between the state and national government. Okay. Now we're going to look here at just the federal powers. The federal government may only exercise those powers granted to it by the Constitution. That's really important. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But there are three types of powers that are given to the federal government by the Constitution. We call powers given to the federal government by the Constitution delegated powers. Delegated powers are those granted by the Constitution. Okay, and there are three types of delegated powers. There are express powers, inherent powers, and implied powers. And like I said, this is going to get a little confusing, so please make sure you're taking good notes here. All right, so expressed powers. These are ones that are clearly stated in the Constitution. These are explicitly stated in the Constitution, things like collecting taxes, printing money. If you read the Constitution, it specifically says that the federal government has the right to print money, regulate interstate commerce, maintaining an army, declaring war, granting patents and copyrights. All of these things are expressly written into the Constitution. Okay. And then we have implied powers, and implied powers are suggested by the other powers stated in the Constitution. Implied powers are those that the federal government has in order to carry out its duties set forth in the Constitution. Okay. Example, regulating, a necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause, which is something we'll get into in more detail later. But regulating federal crimes, prohibiting discrimination, managing labor relations, building national infrastructure, that's implied powers. And inherent powers are assumed by the virtue of the federal government acting as the sovereign authority of the state. So these are just powers that it's obvious that the federal government would do because they are important to being a sovereign government. So things like regulating immigration, acquiring territory, granting diplomatic recognition, protecting the nation against coups and violence. These are all inherent powers. Okay. But the federal government doesn't have unlimited powers. In fact, if you remember from our last unit, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution deals with this. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that those powers not granted to the federal government and not denied to the states are reserved for the states, meaning that the states have whatever rights, or whatever powers, that the federal government is not given by the Constitution. Okay? We call these reserved powers. Reserved powers are reserved for the states. And going back here, delegated powers are given to the federal government. Okay. And again, this is the 10th Amendment here. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Okay. So we call that it's the 10th Amendment, but those are the reserved powers. Okay. All right. Under the federal system of government, there are exclusive powers and concurrent powers. Exclusive powers are those that only the federal government has. Okay, exclusive powers are the delegated powers. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared between federal and state governments. Okay, so we talked about concurrent powers before. Remember, those are things like levying taxes, right? You pay taxes in South Carolina, but you also pay taxes to the federal government. Defining crimes and justice. There are things that are against South Carolina law, and there are things that are against federal law. But both the federal government and the state government can establish what a crime is. Assuming private property for public use. That's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. It's a very specific power of the government. But exclusive powers are those only for the federal government. Coining money. Remember, we said that the state of South Carolina doesn't print its own money. Doesn't make treaties, doesn't tax foreign imports. We call those tariffs. Doesn't regulate interstate commerce. All of these are exclusive to the federal government. Okay. There is a clause in the Constitution, Article 6, Section 2. We call it the Supremacy Clause. Okay, and I'm going to read it here for you, but it's going to be a little confusing because it's very legal sounding. But then we'll talk about what it means. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So basically what that is saying is that the Constitution is the most important law. Nothing is higher than the Constitution, right? A state law cannot bypass the Constitution. The Constitution is here and everything else is here. It says that the Constitution is supreme. Okay, that's why we call it the Supremacy Clause. All right. All right. So on this page here, there's a really good Venn diagram. I don't know if you're familiar with Venn diagrams, but let's see. It's not letting me open that, but let's see if I can change that. All right. So here's the Venn diagram. Venn diagram is, it shows different, but then things that are similar. Okay, so that's just kind of a basic Venn diagram. But let's go back here and look at this all filled in, and you have all of this. You have all of this in your, on your slide, so you can click through to these also. But here's a Venn diagram: federal powers, state powers, right? So things that only the federal government can do, only the state government can do, and then concurrent powers, those that both can do. Okay, so you can go through and fill that out. That'll be good practice for you. I would encourage you to do that. Okay, but we're going to go back to our main slide now. All right. I'm going to let you do slide 8 on your own. You're going to watch the video and answer these questions, but this is going to really kind of reinforce the things that we've talked about so far. Look at the questions. What is the difference between exclusive and concurrent powers? In what ways has federalism strengthened and limited the federal and state governments? How is the power to levy and collect taxes a concurrent power? How do the implied and inherent powers of the federal government differ? Okay, and we've talked about all of those things, but watching the video is going to be really, really helpful, so I encourage you to do that. Okay, but I'll let you do that on your own. All right, and so we're going to go ahead and move on to the quick check. All right, so question 1, what are the powers of the U.S. government that are named and listed in the Constitution? Expressed, implied, inherent, prohibited. Okay, and I know that you're thinking, wow, we had a lot of terms. This is really tough, guys. Yeah, it's going to take some time for you to write these things down and to study them and go back and think about each one of them and what they mean. Okay, so I encourage you to do that. A lot of terms here, but the powers of the government that are named and listed in the Constitution are called expressed powers. Okay. Why does federalism create tension between state and national governments? So think about what federalism is. It's the way that we kind of divide and share power between the central government, the national government, the federal government, as we say, and the state governments. Okay, so why does federalism create tension between state and national governments? Both national and state governments share power. Okay, that sounds right. State and local governments have no support from national government. Well, that doesn't sound right. States are not able to work with each other. Well, that's not true either. The national government dominates the states. I wouldn't say that either. I'd probably say that one. Okay. Which of the examples of power exercised by the federal government? Education laws. Well, we know that schools are state-run, not federal government-run. Marriage and divorce laws. Well, I can tell you that when you get married, that's something that you file with the state. You don't do that with the federal government. Tariff laws, which are a specific type of taxes dealing with imports, and then traffic laws. But remember, we said traffic laws are something that are different from state to state. The answer is tariff laws here. Okay. All right. Use the excerpt from the Constitution to answer the following. This Constitution and laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of the state to the contrary notwithstanding. So what this is saying is that the Constitution is the law of the land, is the most important piece of law. All right, and that refers to which of the following: necessary and proper clause, supremacy clause, states' rights clause, or federal clause. Well, we call that the supremacy clause. All right, guys. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed that. I encourage you to go back and make sure that you are taking good notes on these different powers, because there's a lot of them and they can kind of get confusing. So you want to go back, maybe rewatch this a couple of times to make sure you have it. But otherwise, that's it. Hope you have a wonderful day. Talk to you later.